You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about a brutal murder that occurred while children's games were being played. Now, when hide and seek turned deadly, the switch from innocence to horror happened quickly. There was no winning this game, only life lost. If you don't notice my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so if that's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leaving a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1997 in Nevada. The Iverson family lived in California, but they were in Las Vegas that May. They actually lived in Los Angeles, but had made the trip for a little family vacation. This was Leroy, who was around 58 years old and had two children, 14-year-old Harold and 7-year-old Charisse. Now, that Labor Day weekend, they actually decided to go to this hotel called the Prima Donna, which was a casino, which also had an arcade. This was right on the state line of Nevada and California, which made it perfect for them to be able to go to quickly, and it really advertised as a place where children and adults could go. They had a Ferris wheel, they had that full arcade downstairs, which was separate from the casino area. Of course, children were not able to go to the casino area, so it was supposed to be a safe place for them, and Leroy thought it was the perfect place to bring the kids where he would actually have fun as well. It was around 12:30 a.m., so just after midnight, when Leroy dropped the kids off at the arcade, went upstairs to gamble, and told them that he would be checking on them around every 20 minutes. He also left Harold, the 14-year-old, in charge of his little sister, saying to look after her and make sure she was okay. Now, Harold and Charisse were only half siblings. They had different mothers, but they acted no different at any siblings at this age, especially since they really only had Leroy because Leroy and Charisse's mother had recently split as well. Around 5 hours later at 5:30 a.m., panic would arise inside this hotel because someone had been murdered. Now, this was a fully booked hotel. The casino was completely full due to this being a holiday weekend. Yet this murder wouldn't be due to money or lack thereof, which everyone assumed. In fact, it had nothing to do with the casino at all. It had occurred downstairs in the children's arcade. A security guard had been making their usual rounds. They would go into the bathroom to make sure everything was okay in there, and they had noticed this same pair of legs that they had seen over and over again about an hour long inside this stall. So they began calling out to make sure that person was okay, and they didn't get a response. And so after hearing nothing, the officer actually looked in and found a body. There was a little girl who sat on the toilet with her bottom half undressed, and she was already deceased. Investigators were immediately called. This bathroom was cordoned off so the other guests couldn't get to it. Investigators hoped to identify this girl through the guest at the hotel. However, what they didn't know was that this wouldn't be helpful because this little girl wasn't actually staying in a room. Thankfully, the staff did know who the girl's father was because they had been in contact with him several times that night. It didn't take them long to identify her as Charisse Iverson. Now, she was wearing a little sailor's outfit, and she was known to be sweet and loving. She was only in 2nd grade, and she was known to be polite, and she got amazing grades, and she wanted to be either a nurse, a police officer, or a dancer, but she wouldn't be able to go through with any of her dreams. Now, the staff were aware of this family even though they didn't have a hotel room, and they had just arrived that early morning after midnight at this hotel because of the problems that they had already had with them. You see, earlier that night, Charisse and Harold had been dropped off, and Charisse was then later found completely alone. Harold was nowhere to be found, and since she was only 7 years old, they went to try to contact her parents, and that's when they did find Leroy, and Leroy had, kind of talked to them and everything had been settled, or so they thought. A little while later, they found Charisse once again, contacted Leroy, and once again, the situation was thought to be dealt with until Charisse was found sleeping on one of the chairs in the arcade. The security guards then asked Leroy to leave the casino and take his children. However, they didn't realize that he didn't listen and he went back to gambling. The last time the security guards were involved was only an hour before she would be found murdered. It turned out that the Iverson family had actually been kicked out of another establishment prior to the prima donna. There was a casino hotel across the street called Whiskey Pete's, and they had tried to go there earlier that night, but had the same problems of Leroy just leaving his children to, play with no supervision, and so they were actually fully kicked out and could not get back in. Now, Leroy thought that since going to the prima donna across the street, he would have no problem, but these two establishments actually were owned by the same corporation and were in contact with another. They worked with the same security guard company, so they kind of already knew what Leroy was doing before he even got there. When investigators got to the crime scene and were collecting evidence, Harold was brought in as well as Leroy to be talked to, and Leroy actually had no money left on him at that time, and he was cooperating, but he was very argumentative when he was asked about why he just dropped his children off and refused to look after them. He was basically not wanting to take responsibility. Meanwhile, news was spreading about this brutal murder, and many were blaming the casino for not having enough security to make sure that this didn't happen, and parents were anxious and horrified that it could happen to their children who, were playing in that same arcade. But the casino executives were coming forward at this time to say that it was frustrating because the parents were using these arcades as basically a supervised area for their children when that's not what it was. It's not some sort of daycare to drop them off at. It's a place where they can play under supervision. While media began covering this case, Charisse's mother back in California had no idea what was happening. She was a 28-year-old named Yolanda, and she was actually trying to get custody of Charisse prior to this trip with her father, and it appeared as though Yolanda already believed that Charisse would be better in the care of her instead of Leroy. And it made some wonder, did she already predict that something like this was going to happen? Or was this a fluke accident? While investigators tried to calm Leroy down, Harold was also being interrogated. Now, Harold was showing very different signs of distress than his father, Leroy. You see, Leroy was said to have emotional and physical problems beyond this traumatizing event that he already had, and so he had to get an insulin shot during his interview. But Harold was completely different because he was distraught. He was showing a massive amount of guilt, and he began to say that it was his fault. While investigators knew it was important to watch what they said next and listen to him very carefully, they had a feeling they weren't speaking to the killer. They felt that they were only speaking to a little boy who was supposed to be watching his sister and who had failed. Now, when they got more out of Harold, that's exactly what it was. He felt responsible for leaving Charisse alone and not watching her like he was supposed to be doing. However, nobody really knows, or I could not find, where Harold was during the time of the murder or during that entire time when they were in the arcade, and no more clues were actually obtained from the family, but thankfully the officers had one huge tool to aid them. Down in the arcade, security cameras were actually up and working at this time, and homicide detective Phil Ramos retrieved the footage for review. Now, Harold was then released from custody, and he traveled back home, where he actually gave an interview to KCBS TV, and he said that his family were always used to staying together and that his father did check on him and Charisse during that night, and it was found that Harold, who had just lost his little sister, had quite a bit of loss in his life already. He had a different mother than Charisse, like I told you, and she had actually passed away along with his little brother. This was only a year prior to Charisse's death. When it was time for Charisse's funeral, this was held at Paradise Baptist Church in Los Angeles, and reporters were swarming the funeral home. Leroy was there, and everybody wanted an interview from him. The biggest question for him they had was, were the rumors true? Did Leroy really ask the hotel to pay for him a room and the funeral services in order for him to not sue them. This was a rumor going around, and investigators claimed that they never heard him say this, but that he might have spoken to the hotel about it, and they didn't know, so they couldn't confirm nor deny the rumors. 2 days after the murder, the surveillance footage was actually released to the public, and they claimed that they believed their suspect had gone down to the arcade to look for a girl, to stalk and murder a victim. Now, the reality was even worse, if you can believe that. The footage showed two men who were talking to Charisse. Now, they were both white, appeared to be, in their teens, early 20s, and they were quite young, but definitely older than Charisse. Due to the graininess of the cameras in the 90s, investigators couldn't fully identify these men. However, they did have a few witnesses who would come forward. Now, these witnesses said that they had actually talked to these men, and he was wearing a baseball cap over dark brown hair. He also had pierced nipples, and he wore a stud earring. He was wearing a t-shirt, baggy surfer shorts, and loafers. The second man in the footage was thought to be in his late teens, early 20s as well, with short dark hair, with sideburns, wearing a dark button-down shirt, and dark knee-length shorts as well. Around 3 a.m., these two boys were seen talking to Charisse, and at 3:47 a.m., Charisse would run into the women's bathroom, and the two boys followed shortly after, making sure to look around first. Only 2 minutes later, one of the boys with the sideburns came out of the bathroom and just stood at the entrance, kind of like a lookout. And then 24 minutes later, the second came out as well. Charisse never came out again, and during that time period, 8 women had gone into the bathroom and come out not saying anything, not believing anything was suspicious. Ramos said that when you watched the tape, it appeared as though 3 children were just playing some sort of game like hide and seek. It wasn't strange that no one intervened with what was about to happen because no one had any idea. 10 minutes later, the boys had left through the swimming pool entrance, and on the outside of the building, there were no cameras, so the boys could have gone anywhere, and the cameras couldn't point them in the right direction after this. Investigators sent out photos of these suspects to different police departments. They were also going to mail the guests that were staying at that hotel that night pictures as well. This was around 2,700 rooms, and they were also going through the sex offender registry to see if they matched any of these descriptions, but they were coming up empty-handed. Now, during this time, the bathroom in the arcade did have a wall that was put up so no one could use it, but the arcade and the casino were still open to the public. The next day, though, investigators would get a tip from a girl in California. She was a teenager who claimed that her classmates had been talking about being involved in the murder and getting advice on how to get away with it. Now, when she saw the footage that was displayed on TV, she actually realized he was telling the truth. It was him. She named the boy who was talking to her as 18-year-old Jeremy Strohmeier, and the other boy in the footage was his best friend, 17-year-old David Cash. Investigators headed to Jeremy's home in Long Beach and arrested him, and it really didn't take him long to start talking. But what he would say would be worse than the obvious and more horrific than anything investigators had dealt with before. It turned out these two boys had started off at Whiskey Pete's casino and arcade across the street, just as Charisse had as well, and they eventually moved to the Prima Donna as well. Jeremy confessed that he and David began playing hide and seek with Charisse, and then he told her that she should go and hide in the women's bathroom because he couldn't go in there. They then proceeded to follow her inside.
Surveillance cameras there show the two boys playing video games at 3:30 in the morning. Strohmeier then spots Charisse Iverson, whose father was gambling nearby. The cameras record Charisse walking into a women's restroom, followed by Jeremy Strohmeier, and then a minute later by David Cash.
Jeremy said that they began play fighting with wet paper towels, and then Charisse pushed the wet floor sign into him, and this is when everything changed. Jeremy said he basically snapped, and he got extremely angry, charged forward to Charisse, pushed her into the bathroom stall, and locked it behind him. Now, that is when he put his hand over Charisse's mouth and began to sexually assault her. Every time someone would walk into the bathroom, he would apply more pressure over her mouth so she could not speak or scream. That is when Jeremy decided that he needed to kill her, and he began strangling her, but she was still breathing. That is when he didn't stop. He decided to put his hand under her jaw, his right arm across the back of her skull, and he lifted her up and twisted to break her neck. He said he did this just like he had seen on TV. However, the first time it didn't work. She was still alive. He said he had heard a loud pop, but horrifically enough, this still didn't kill her, and she survived. And so Jeremy, who could have stopped there, walked away and let her live, didn't do that. He snapped her neck again. This time she didn't survive, and he folded her in half and stuffed her in the toilet. The detective asked Jeremy if he tried to give her CPR after the first time he tried to strangle her and she survived, and Jeremy said he didn't. He knew he had to kill her because she had seen his face. The entire interview, Jeremy sat showing no signs of remorse or nervousness. His story was told in this monotone voice with very flat affect, which is basically just the condition where people don't express their emotions in the same way. They don't show normal facial expressions. And Detective Ramos said that he spoke like it was his high school field trip he was talking about. He asked Jeremy why he would do something like this and said that it wasn't due to his lack of girlfriends because Jeremy had many. And Jeremy said that yeah, he did have many and didn't answer the question.
He had absolutely no remorse at all. He described in graphic detail how he killed Charisse, what he did to her, what he wanted to do to her, and why he wanted to do it.
After that, I just wanted to leave. And I noticed that the girl was still breathing, barely. I didn't want to leave her that way, so I tried to break her neck.
Can I ask you one question? Sure. Did you, when she was having this labored breathing, did you consider trying to give her a little bit of CPR yourself and then take off?
No, that never crossed my mind.
He was very graphic about it. He showed me just how he positioned his hands and snapped her neck and trying to kill her like he had seen on TV.
But what does his friend David have to do with the murder? Was he involved, or did he step out and not know what was happening? He had been entering the bathroom and staying only for a few minutes, but Jeremy claimed that David had come in and looked over the stall to see what he was doing with Charisse.
I tapped him on the head, because it was completely out of character, and he didn't really respond to me. He gave me kind of a blank stare. So, in my opinion, it was like time for me to get out of there.
Why?
Well, when an 18-year-old male grabs a 7-year-old child, that's not a position I want to be in. Based on what I saw, it wasn't something I wanted to stick around and see what would materialize.
Did you say to him, Jeremy, come on, stop, let's go?
I was giving him a look as if, that he shouldn't be doing that.
But you never said, stop, get out of here, this is wrong.
Verbally, I did not say that, but my body language certainly suggested it.
Did you think to turn him in to the police?
The thought crossed my mind, but I didn't act on it.
Why?
I know that his day of reckoning is coming. I didn't want to be the one that turned him in.
You felt that was more important than to report a murderer?
Even though he had told me that he had committed murder, it was really hard for me to fathom Jeremy as a quote-unquote murderer.
But he told you he was.
I understand that, but he's also my best friend. We're taking AP English together.
Now, when Jeremy exited the bathroom after killing Charisse, he said that David said you were sexually assaulting her, but didn't say anything more. They then left the casino with Jeremy's father, Cash, who was gambling in the same place Leroy was. And right before leaving, Jeremy actually stopped to talk to two girls who ended up being the witnesses that helped in this investigation. But Jeremy and David didn't talk another word about what had happened and headed back to California. But meanwhile, the guards and hotel security were running out of the bathroom screaming. The next day, they were back at Woodrow Wilson High School, and Jeremy began bragging about what he did. Jeremy Strohmeier was actually from a very wealthy family in the area. He had been born on October 11th, 1978, and was actually adopted as a baby from the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services, or DCF. Now, his adoptive family, the Strohmeiers, were told that his parents couldn't take care of him. And so they were more than happy, once they were matched with him, to bring him into this loving home, and they were informed that he was a perfectly healthy little boy. They would find out later that this was anything but the truth, but we will come back to this a little later. When Jeremy was identified as the possible killer, investigators actually had to chase him as he attempted to flee from his backyard. And after that, they were given the task to get him back to Nevada. The problem was no commercial airlines wanted to fly him. And so that is when investigators realized that they had a solution, because Jeremy actually had his own plane. You see, he was from an extremely wealthy family who had bought him a plane after he got his pilot's license. He wasn't some poor kid down in his luck with a rough upbringing. He was an 18-year-old who knew how to fly a plane, and during his flight, all he wanted to talk about was what he knew about planes rather than the murder. Investigators found through a search of his home that on his computer there were hundreds of sexually explicit photos of children. Now, his past girlfriends also came forward to say that he made them dress up in little girl outfits. But while Jeremy sat in jail awaiting trial, his friend David was living a regular life. You see, in Nevada at this time, there was no law requiring citizens to report a crime or stop a crime, and so he wasn't guilty, and he was free to do whatever he wanted because he did nothing illegal. However, the high school that they both attended did prohibit him from going to any graduating ceremonies with his class, but he did end up showing up by driving by in a limo and waving at the cameras as he drove by. Now, Sharice's mother, Yolanda, wanted David to stand trial for his part in the murder and not making Jeremy stop or going to get help. She said that this wasn't a race issue or a political issue, it was a human being issue and a justice issue for a little girl who never would be able to reach her goals.
He seen Jeremy Strohmeier put his hands over her mouth and carried her in the bathroom. He seen it. Anytime you stand and you look at something happening to anybody, not only your child, any human being, a dog, a cat, or whatever, you seen that happen. So you a murder within yourself. You still got the blood of my babies on your hand.
You think he is an accessory to murder?
Yes, he is. I think he should be charged with accessory to the murder of my child because he could have did something to stop it. He didn't do anything.
It was said that morally, David had the blood of Sharice on his hands, and a group put together by Yolanda actually got 20,000 signatures to charge David in the death, but this did nothing. They also wanted Nevada to enact the Sharice Iverson Memorial Bill to make it a crime to witness or to have knowledge of a crime and not report it to the police. Yolanda said she was so tired. She had had 4 nervous breakdowns since she realized that her daughter had been murdered, but she was going to keep going to get justice for her. It was finally time for Jeremy's trial, September of 1998, and his defense attorney was Leslie Abersom, who was famous for representing the Mendez brothers who had killed their parents. Now, she was very high profile, and she wanted Jeremy's confession thrown out because she said he was not given a lawyer at this time. But the police did come forward saying Jeremy was, and he waived his rights to a lawyer. She then tried to say that the police were bullies who intimidated him into giving a confession, and Jeremy was suddenly saying that he didn't remember the crime at all due to being high on drugs and alcohol, that David told him what he did and he went along with it, and that's the only reason why he knew what he did. He also began to say that David might have actually been the real one to kill her. David took the stand against Jeremy, saying that when he went to the bathroom that night, he tried to get Jeremy's attention and get him away from Sharice, but Jeremy ignored him, so he left and waited outside. However, Jeremy claimed that as soon as he walked out of the bathroom after he had murdered Sharice, David asked him if Sharice had been sexually aroused. David later began saying that to Jeremy that they could get away with murder, and he began telling him how to hide everything. Jeremy said that if David had tried to stop him that day, he could have. And he ultimately called David an arrogant, unfeeling hater. When David was asked why he would ask that question about Sharice being sexually aroused, he said that's just the way he thought. Sharice's parents spoke up in court saying, "You are so evil that if I had a wish, I'd put you to death the same way you put my child to death. I want you to feel every pain you put me through. Are you a demon? Are you the devil? I hate to look at your evil, crazy face." Leroy said that he wasn't even going to curse him because he was already cursed by the devil. Jeremy apologized to the family, saying that he knows he's going to be barren for life and that he is haunted every day. He said that he is condemned not only by the state but by his own mind, and he always thought of himself as this good guy, that he wasn't an immoral or unfeeling person, but he had done a monstrous thing. Now, I told you that Jeremy wasn't exactly what his adoptive parents thought, right? Well, he had been adopted at 18 months after the Strohmeiers had started searching for a child, and their only request being that this child didn't have a family history of mental illness. Yet 6 months after the adoption was finalized, they could no longer turn things around. They received a letter. This told them that Jeremy's mother appeared to be mentally ill, but this was only due to drug abuse. So they went on with their lives, getting Jeremy no help. In truth, they would find out much later that his birth mother, who was a teenager, who had been hospitalized at a mental hospital 60 different times, was diagnosed as a chronic schizophrenic. His biological father was in prison at the time, and he was born inside a mental hospital, so of course he had to be put into the foster system. This is when DCF kept secrets from the adoptive family. Now, what they don't want you to know is that there is a long history of them doing this to adoptive parents, making sure that they don't know what they're really getting into until it's too late. There are many times when the system will actually purposely keep details away so you adopt this child, even though you specifically said you did not want these things. As awful as it sounds to say, "Oh, I don't want this in a child," it's still your choice to be able to make, because these families who did not want to deal with this now struggle to get help and deal with these behaviors that can often come from children who are in the foster system, who had either household or pregnancy trauma that can come from alcohol abuse, from mental illness, from drugs, from many different things. And then in the foster care system, that can cause even more attachment issues. Now, added on top of the fact that mental health services are not easy to find help with, and can definitely not be cheap. Like I said, the Strohmeiers knew that they could not handle this, but that choice was taken away from them. And it wasn't something that they noticed right away either. I mean, they could not get him the care that he needed from a young age, if help was even possible, because a lot of the times with attachment issues, you cannot find help for these children, unfortunately. But Jeremy grew up as a wonderful kid. He was an honor student. He was on the volleyball team. He was planning to go into the Air Force. His parents believed he was well adjusted, and so they all actually moved to Singapore. And this was when Jeremy was in high school. He did really well readjusting to Singapore. However, they did notice that he was getting more into alcohol there and drinking, and so they did move back eventually, not due to his drinking, just because they wanted to move back to Los Angeles, and he began getting into drugs and staying up all night and getting bad grades. And this is really when they started seeing that downfall. But in this case, for Jeremy, it was already too late. And he was said to be different at that time, but not enough for his parents to be fully concerned, that especially not that he would do something like this. Not until he snapped. But Jeremy used all of this in court, saying that because his parents were kept in the dark about his genetics and weren't able to get him the help he needed, they were to blame. Now, DCF came forward saying that the system was much different now. However, that is proven again and again not to be true. Ultimately, Jeremy did confess with a plea deal that blocked him from being able to have a death penalty. So this was only hours before his trial was set, and then he no longer needed a trial, and he was then sentenced to 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Jeremy would actually be spending his sentence away from the general prison population in administrative segregation. I couldn't find exactly why, but I'm assuming it's because child predators are attacked in prison, and so they needed to keep him away, but I could not find anywhere where that actually confirmed that. Now, his adoptive parents, the Strohmeiers, decided to sue DCF for $1 million for withholding information. The family said that by the social workers doing this, they made a sacrifice out of Jeremy and Sharice. Now, due to the lawsuit, Adoption laws in California have been said to change, and there is now a law where you have to get the medical history of birth parents. However, in many states, this still has not changed, and there are still so many secrets and ways of manipulation. 2 years later, Jeremy appealed his sentence, saying that his lawyer pressured him to make that deal. However, this was denied, and that same exact year, Charisse's father, Leroy, actually passed away. He was sick at the time, and Jeremy then tried to appeal, saying that juveniles weren't mentally developed enough to understand right and wrong and the severity of their choices. But since he was 18 years old, this too was denied. But it would have been anyway, because the judge had heard him use very racist language against Charisse. Sadly, it turned out that Charisse wasn't the first victim in the area. You see, the first establishment that we talked about, Whiskey Pete's, they had a murder happen there as well. Well, it was really just a kidnapping happening there, but it was 10 years prior to Charisse's murder, and a little boy disappeared in that resort. He too was 7 years old. His name was Alexander Harris, and he had too been living in California, and then his family were taking a road trip. They were having a family reunion, and they had stopped at this resort on the way back home just to rest a little bit. It was a Thanksgiving Day reunion, and then on November 28th, Alexander was in the arcade while his family were all playing in the casino, and by 11 a.m., Alexander was gone. No one could find him anywhere, and unlike Charisse's case, they searched all around the hotel, the arcade, the casino, and he was not there. The family were all ruled out as suspects immediately, and witnesses claimed that they had seen a man holding Alexander's hand and walking out of the hotel, but they looked so much like father and son that they didn't think anything of it. He was thought to be in his 30s, and thankfully even in the late 80s there were surveillance cameras, and investigators were able to see this fuzzy, grainy image of a man walking down the hallway holding hands with Alexander. The witnesses, though, had very skewed perceptions of what this man looked like. It was all different. Some said that they believed he was from 5'7" to 5'9", between 160 and 175 pounds. Others said that he was 6 feet. One sketch, he had straight collar-length blonde hair. The other, he had short hair. And he was said to be wearing silver-rimmed glasses and a brown members-only type jacket with dark trousers.
Wasn't screaming for help, or he looked like a young boy that was in trouble for doing something. He was being taken back to his room.
Hotel guest James Austin overheard a frantic mother describing her lost son.
I turned to her and said, "Ma'am, I saw a young child that meets that description who was with, and I did say his father." And she said, "He's not with his father." And she asked me to describe him, and I did. She said that was my son.
After a full search of the resort, Alexander was still not found. And after his family were supposed to leave, they couldn't, because they were still missing a family member. It would be 33 days later when a tip would come in. This was from a gardener who claimed to have found a body under a trailer, and investigators actually had to use a crane to lift up the trailer that was actually not too far from the hotel. They actually used this trailer for off-duty executives of the casino to stay in, but a body was found underneath. It had no visible trauma, and it was found that Alexander had been suffocated. His glasses were found near his body, and by this point, 3 suspects had been spoken to, and all of them had alibis. Investigators had slowly been working through everyone staying at the hotel during that time, and then 4 months after the disappearance, a man named Howard Lee Haupt was arrested. Now, he was a computer programmer who had been staying at the hotel Whiskey Pete's for a land sailing tournament. Howard immediately denied any involvement, saying he was with a friend that night, he had no criminal record, and he passed 2 lie detector tests. Yet he was booked and charged with murder. This case was said to be even more publicized than Charisse's due to the unfortunate stigma of white victims getting more coverage than black victims. And Harold was transported in an unmarked police car where he had to lie flat in the back of the seat so nobody would try to kill him, basically.
At some point in time on that weekend, my path and the path of the perpetrator of this crime may have passed may have not have, but I was in the facility.
He claimed he had spent 4 hours being forced to confess to something he didn't do. And during the trial, it was found that witnesses couldn't confirm that he was the man that they saw. So after 5 weeks of trial, 1 hour of deliberation, Harold was found not guilty and was released.
We, the jury, in the above entitled case, find the defendant, Howard Lee Haupt, not guilty of count 2, murder in the first degree.
He said that this trial was a show that he had to be a part of, and he was in what he described as a hostage situation. A year later, Harold sued the police department for $4 million, and he claimed that they ignored evidence such as a fingerprint on Alexander's glasses that were found at the scene. He was given $1 million, and after he was acquitted, no more suspects were found and this case went cold. No one has been charged in Alexander's murder, and it is actually no longer listed as a cold case on the department's website. It's like it's been forgotten about, like it never happened. And only 10 years later, Charisse was murdered just across the street. Homicide detective Phil Ramos, who worked on Charisse's case, said that he still sees Charisse's smiling face that he had seen in a photograph of her, and that her case is one he will always remember due to the sheer innocence of the victim and the brutality of how she was killed. He said he was so mad at God when he saw that crime scene that it tested his faith, and he's still disappointed that they couldn't charge David. And the guard who found Charisse's body actually had to have therapy for quite a while after that, and some of the staff would get panic attacks. But Charisse's case had such a huge impact not on him, not just on the family, but the world. You see, 2 years after her murder, the Charisse Iverson bill was put into effect in Nevada, requiring citizens to notify police when crimes are happening to children. This is what her mother, Yolanda, had been fighting for, and the next year it became a law in California as well. Restrictions were also tightened in casinos in order to stop young children being left without a parent, and the arcades are no longer just kept open all night long. Now, Jeremy remains in prison, but he is now married to a woman he met while writing letters to her. His wife has said that not all prison wives are desperate or delusional. They just love. And Jeremy ended up writing a letter to the Iverson family saying, "I want to ask for their forgiveness, and I want them to know I'd give anything to trade places with Charisse. I just want them to know I am sorry. More sorry than words can ever say. I wish nothing but peace and good lives for them, wherein their lives are not defined by this horrible tragedy as mine has been." He said he has also been working with other inmates to get them to think less impulsively. Now, the man who walked free of all of this, David Cash, went on to graduate from the University of California at Berkeley. He didn't stay out of the spotlight either. He did many interviews and he said, "I'm not going to get upset over somebody else's life. I just worry about myself first. I'm not going to lose sleep over somebody else's problem. I'm no idiot. I'll get my money out of this." He then went on to talk about the fact that his fame was helping him score women. His classmates tried to get him kicked out of the university, but the university said that they had no basis to do so since he wasn't charged.
We want Cash out! We want Cash out!
Many of his fellow students there are demanding the university expel him. They are infuriated not only by his failure to save Charisse Iverson, but also by remarks he made this summer on a Los Angeles radio program.
How much am I supposed to sit down and cry about this? I mean, let's be reasonable here. Is my life supposed to halt for days, weeks, and months on end?
And if that weren't bad enough, he added this.
The simple fact remains, I do not know this little girl. I do not know starving children in Panama. I do not know, people that die of disease in Egypt.
Some people have called you the Bad Samaritan. You think that's an appropriate name?
No, most certainly not. These names that people call me, I've been called the antithesis of today's teens, a bad Samaritan, a textbook sociopath. I've been called it all.
We asked David Cash to explain his behavior to a group of fellow students we assembled on the campus of Berkeley, and he agreed.
A lot of people say, how come you didn't stop the murder? How come you stopped the rape? I never felt that anything was going to happen to her. If I thought that, that was going to happen, of course I would have stopped it. I don't want this on my conscience that, I allowed, somebody to die.
Is it on your conscience?
Not to the extent that
yes or no? Is it on your conscience?
Not to the extent that most people would want it to be.
Yes or no?
Not to the extent that most people would want it to be.
Okay.
I really have a hard time believing that you thought that nothing wrong was going on.
Yeah, no
Doesn't
chance.
it alarm you that for 25 minutes he's still in the bathroom with a 7-year-old girl? I mean, that's just not a normal occurrence, and wouldn't you want to go back in there?
Okay, let's think of it. Let's say after 25 minutes I come to the conclusion that he's murdered this girl, all right? Do I storm into the bathroom, and then what happens to me? Okay, let's say a security guard walks in. I'm sitting here, with my best friend with the dead body there. You know what I mean?
I think it's very clear to all of us that David Cash's mindset was, what is best for me? What is going to keep me out of trouble? You have expressed no remorse, no feeling that you felt bad at all that this young girl was murdered.
How is it that you can sit there and feel comfortable with yourself, waiting 3 days when you could have assisted the police in pursuing Jeremy? You could have done any number of things, but you did nothing.
It's easy for you people to say, oh, you should have done this, you should have done that. Like, you didn't know Jeremy.
He ended up graduating with a nuclear engineering degree, and he says he would have done nothing different in his life. Do you believe David should have been sentenced in this murder? Did Jeremy have any remorse for what he had done, or was that all an act? Was this murder really to do with him being under the influence, or would he have escalated to murder regardless? Do you think his adoption and his family history caused him to do this? But let me know what you think, and don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces.